It's really a great pleasure to introduce Anna-Kaisa Kultima. Anna-Kaisa works both at Tampere University and in Aalto University, mostly nowadays in Aalto University. But I'm pretty confident in saying that she's really one of the main experts on the topic of this talk, that is studying games as created. I had a little bit of hard time to understand what praxiology meant, but I understood it's like comes from praxis, and she will explain it better. So this is about games and game research, and Anna-Kaisa has been studying this for over 10 years, first in Tampere, and then she's continuing in Aalto University and Tampere. And she's also the president of the Finnish Game Jam Association. And we've been collaborating with them for many years in creating games for quantum physics. So it's really a great pleasure. And Anna-Kaisa?
Thank you. So can you also hear me with this mic, or is that, I think that you can still hear me whether the mic works or not. So my name is Anna-Kaisa Kultima, and I'm really happy that so many people came to listen to this talk. It is a little bit of different kind of science, and also an interesting mix of different sciences. And in this talk, I'll also talk about my journey and the research process that I've had for past 10 years. And then at the end, also tell a little bit of results of my research. So yeah, game design praxiology is the topic today. And I'll go into details with that a bit later as well, if you don't mind. Yeah, I said I'm a game researcher, also coordinate a lot of different things, a lecture on games, and I also been doing some design projects. I'm a graduate of University of Turku, so theoretical philosophy is my main subject. And maybe for the first glance, you might seem like it doesn't have anything to do with games. But then again, obviously, philosophy has to do with everything. So that's been kind of interesting journey for me too. I call myself a jamtivist, and that means like I'm an activist for or evangelist for game jam culture. And maybe if you don't know what it is, it's an event where people get together and they create games together. Yeah, my topic is studying games as created, and the background for this kind of a topic is called usually game studies. So it's an area of academic interest, of looking at mainly digital games, but also non-digital games, like live-action role-playing games or card games, or sometimes even sports. Sports is a game, or different sports are games. But game studies is a relatively young area of academic interest, around maybe actively for the I don't know, third wave of game studies is around 15 years to 20 years, depending how you count. And well, the digital games have become so kind of central to the modern culture that it's very important for us to understand the multitude of the cultures within. And oftentimes we also concentrate a lot to within the game studies to understand either the artifact, the games in different kinds of ways, the cultures that they create, but also the players, like what kind of players play what kind of games, and how are the cultures of playing games formed, and what kind of social activity is within those groups. So for instance, in the University of Tampere Game Research Lab, where I've been working for 11 years, we've been studying like how much Finnish people in general play games. And if we count all kinds of games, the percentage is somewhere close to 100. So it is something like 98% has played at least some kind of game. And then around 80% is like more regularly, and then digital games go somewhere to 60. And also, it's important to say that the average age of a player has grown with digital games as well. So we are closing the middle age. So it's not just kids. But anyway, so oftentimes when the usage of game studies or understanding the digital playing cultures can answer to, for instance, questions that in a popular discussions is very, sometimes very active. Like what kind of impact different kinds of digital playing cultures have on our everyday lives. And our concerns usually are to do with the most vulnerable people, which is kids or other types of groups. So we might be thinking that what if they play too much, and what if there's like problematic playing, and what kind of things we could do in order to help that. There are obviously, like in any kind of cultures and any kind of phenomena, there are things to be actually concerned for. On the other hand, we also might think that there is a lot of power in digital games, for instance, in teaching and learning new things. But from the perspective of a game researcher, the question is as kind of weird as if we would say, what kind of impact texts have on our lives? Well, we've had texts for quite a long time, so maybe we kind of know about it already much more extensively. But it's important for everybody to understand that games can be very different things from one to another. So oftentimes when we talk about, for instance, the media panic discussions about the impacts of digital games, we talk about games from the early or late 90s, like Doom, maybe, or the games that have elements that we haven't seen in previous game cultures. But games can be very different. So 90 to 92, we even had in a national radio at Radio Mafia, we had a game that was played on radio. So it's a role-playing game where you called in. It's a contact show, so people called in, and they played a fiction story together till the end. So whenever there was a caller and they couldn't solve something, they died, there was another caller that picked up and played the same character. So we have a lot of different kinds of games in the world. So games can be really, really different things. So it's very difficult to say what kind of impact games have in our lives. In the same way that the difference between text message and a novel is very, very big. But what I'm more interested in, and also comes to this kind of a area of discussion, is that games are always made by people. Well, there are some artificial intelligence projects that there are also games that are made by computers themselves completely. But games are created by someone. And for the historical reasons of the modern game studies, we tend to not to look too much into the creator. So a lot of the modern game studies was born into culture studies and mostly literature studies, people studying different kinds of texts. And it hasn't been fashionable within that area to look at the author, for instance. Maybe some of you know this area much better than I do. But it is absolutely vital to understand, as a kind of a common knowledge for everybody, how games are created. So for the understanding how texts are created, we have much more understanding because we also grew up in the school system where we learned to write texts. But we didn't grow up learning to create games. So games are made by different kinds of people. It's a very global market. There is a lot of game makers around the world, and obviously they have very different backgrounds. We have games from all sorts of places, like Finland, for instance. We have a lot of games that have come from Finland. You don't necessarily always know when you play a game, for instance, on your mobile phone, like where it was created, because it's a digital good and you can get it easily without understanding the logistics. So, for instance, the game that you are playing might be somebody created in Iran, Australia, in Russia, or in the States, in the southern parts of America. Like anybody can create games these days. The thing that is people share within the industry of digital games is that it's an industry of passion. So the creators are very passionate in creating their artifacts. It is a culture that transformed from a hobby culture into a professional culture. And the topic that I'm been studying is basically understanding these people and their kind of environment and their processes. And that's why I'm talking about game design praxiology. And the word praxiology comes from, I absolutely have stolen it from a design theorist called Nigel Cross. Nigel Cross has been talking about how design research is divided into praxiology, phenomenology, and epistemology. And to the design theorists, it's important to understand how the design cognition, for instance, work. So, for instance, how the creators form the special kind of knowledge that is needed for designing, but also the artifacts hold information. So you might do analysis of different kinds of created objects. That's in the more of the phenomenology side. And then we might want to know how different kinds of things are created. For instance, what is the process behind creating a building? So that is the praxiology. But it also covers lots of different things what comes to the creation process. And I have stolen it to actually mean the praxis in general, also the working cultures of the game developers. But yeah, that's the background from design research, which is in itself, for someone that has a background in philosophy, it's super interesting because it also claims that epistemology is in disarray, and that's why they need to do their own. But going back to my personal background, so game studies is a very, very multidisciplinary field. So when I was studying here at the University of Turku for philosophy, there was no such thing as game studies as a subject of study for anybody, anywhere. And so people that started to study games and had this common interest, they came from very different areas. And this is my personal history, but people have very different kinds of backgrounds for that. I'm going to explain a little bit why this is this way. So I have not studied physics or geophysics, but that's where I was born. So I'm actually from Sodankylä, and even more closely from the Sodankylä Geophysical Observatory. So yes, I was born in a research center. Almost also born, but not exactly. And my father was a geophysicist. So for the first 20 years, I was, a lot of the engagement with other people was with scientists and their kids. And then I came here to study theoretical philosophy. And from here, I went to University of Lapland to work with educational scientists in cognitive science, and then also later, also game studies, so also up until year 2005. And then I moved to Tampere to go and work on an actual game study project. And I've moved from that, so for past 11 years, I've discovered that actually design research is my area. But it's not my education. So that's a very typical story for a lot of game scholars, that we have had to discover an area that would actually help us to tackle the issues that we're interested in. So currently I am in a very long process of finalizing my PhD, which is covering data from 10 years. And there's tons of different kinds of data that I've used for this study, and a bunch of articles that are related to this work. And I'll go back to details more of that. I'm going to show pictures how I've done it too. But I've not only done academic work, because this is very much related to design research as well. You need to be more involved with the processes, and then also more involved with the communities. So basically I've done also ethnographic kind of approach to my work. And I call it accidental ethnography, but I hope there's no one in the room that gets really offended if ethnography is used in a very wrong way. So if that's so, just forget it.
I don't know what it means exactly, so
Ethnography. I'm not going to explain it here. Okay. All right. But yeah, I've been also participating to the industry in itself as an expert in different roles, giving money to companies in funding instances, and also done some games myself. So for the past 10 years, I've been to many industry conferences and talked to many people. I've been in different kinds of get-togethers. So for instance, today there is a local IGDA meeting, which is International Game Developers Association meeting. And in those meetings, you meet the developers that you want to study. And the new thing is game jams, so events where people actually create games. But I've met many people for the past 10 years, so over 300 direct informants and even more so in more informal way. And when I say accidental ethnography, is that I did interview studies and different kinds of experiments first, but I wasn't completely sure if I asked the right questions. So I started to do also these gatherings and conference kind of visits in order to understand the field better. And it turned out to be that I was actually getting more information in going to the field. And since I didn't do any field notes, I was taking a lot of pictures. And they became my field notes. And the reason why I took a lot of pictures is that I was so fascinated by the development of the digital cameras. The smaller they got, the more convenient it became to use them. So that was a nice coincidence for my data collection, because I was very, very eager to take the photos on very different kinds of things. So all the photos that you see here are also from those field trips. But I've done different kinds of things. So this is a brainstorming game that is used for the creative process of the developers. I've done the very kind of typical way of gathering interview data with the recorder. But I've also used visual aids to make them talk a bit less abstract. I've done some studio tours. This is a photo from a specific study that I did when I was asking why game companies had playful elements in their interiors. And then tons of industry get-togethers where I had several informal discussions. And then later, like 2010 onwards, I got interested into the culture of game jams, which to me, because I was initially interested of the beginning of the creative process of game development, which is the idea. But idea in itself, just a kind of, as a written format, like a small snippet, for instance, doesn't really help too much a game developer. You need to do something that is interactable so that you understand what kind of idea you have created. So game jams seem to me like a combination of prototyping and brainstorming. So that's why I got into that. But in order to understand the inner works of your subjects, which is in my case, is the game developers, I've done also design projects. And some of them are digital games, but some of them are more on the trends that are combining different fields. And this is the most recent one, and it is an interactive chair that laughs. And then, of course, I've spent time thinking about what did I actually do and what kind of things did I actually gathered. And it's been one of the most painful things, obviously, with your research, when you put everything together and try to kind of form some theoretical or pre-theoretical thoughts. So here are my results. And maybe for a game developer, these are some things that are even trivial. But these are the kind of, there's tons of things that I've learned during the 11 years. But these are the things that are important for anybody to understand, at least of the current practices of game development in digital world. So first is the game design is timely and particular. This is one of my favorite because my background is in theoretical philosophy and epistemology in special. So there's something really interesting that happens in terms of cognition in design. And that is that you need to know very particular things. So there is this very kind of interesting blog writing by a famous game designer, that is explaining what it is to be a game designer. And a game designer, it's a problem of door. So the game designer needs to think about where to put the door, whether the door is open, you can open it or not, whether when you go through the door, whether there is an enemy behind the door. There's tons of different, but like what color of the door it is. Like it's similar to any kind of a designer. It is not just to shape the thing in abstract, but to actually decide every single detail so that the thing becomes reality. And there is something very interesting in that, because the cognition or the epistemological, epistemic processes are a bit different than what we've learned from science. When we go to more humanistic approaches, there is a kind of a understanding of idiosyncrasy, so you kind of you are looking at special things. But in design, we're talking about how, like in design, we use also very kind of generalized knowledge that is more what we understand the scientific knowledge to be about. But oftentimes the most important thing is something that might be not even easy to, hopefully not easy to repeat. So you are trying to figure out these kind of a very special cases. And for the case of digital game industry, it's interesting because it's been changing for the past 2 decades so fast that the information is not easily cumulative. So the change is very difficult environment for the developers to be at. But their attitude towards that is that they had acknowledged that thing. So everything is changing all the time, and you need to kind of create the knowledge while you go. So it's not sometimes, like what we can do in the game studies, we can't offer too much knowledge because it's too slow or it's too general. So they need to have answers to much more particular questions. So things get, like ideas for instance, get old really fast. Oh, there's more, I can explain. If you felt confused, I'm most happy to talk about the first one. But then also, game design is value pluralistic. So if you are playing, for instance, any kind of digital game, anything like that is absolutely a piece of shit or piece of gold. That is to do with your valuation of certain kind of things in games. But there are tons of different kinds of players, and we value different things, and there's also tons of different kinds of creators, and they value different things. And now that we've done few kind of decades of digital game making, we start to also see these kind of different valuations. So it's becoming so broad that we can create all sorts of different kinds of things from different perspectives. So somebody might think that the only value for a good digital game is whether it makes money. Or some people might say that if it solves a scientific question, then it's very valuable. So there are many ways to value games. And it also affects to the creators themselves what kind of valuations they have for their craft. Game design process is opportunistic is a kind of different wording. If you would be a game developer, you would say game design process is iterative. So as in any software development, you need to do kind of iterative loops for your craft so that you can test it and see how it works, and then you go back and you do changes, and then you do it again, and so on and so forth. But I think, and I'm arguing, that the iterative process is also filled with a lot of opportunistic design attitudes. So sometimes developers, they talk about their games that they actually found something while creating, and that have become a vital point of the design later. So when they set up their process, they also leave space for opportunities to arise within the creative process of them creating games. So it's not just iterative in terms of, if you're a software developer, not in terms of trying to improve the quality, but sometimes game developers need to cut the features or change something in the middle of the process when they find out that it's not really working in the way that they were imagining. So that is very interesting for game creation as well. And then this is very simple. If you have a game idea and want to sell it to a developer, I need to say to you that they have tons of ideas. So it's not going to happen. You're not going to convince them. You need to be very good at pitching your idea. You need to have something to kind of bringing to the table: money, skills, time. But the whole process of creating games is filled with ideas. And the more you do games, the more ideas you get. So that's how it works. But it is very common kind of a conflict between people that don't know how to create games and people that would like to create games. And then at the end, game design practice is nurtured and nurtured by the surrounding ecosystem. This is almost trivial to anything, but we are just kind of arriving to the fact that we understand that it's not happening in void, but different kinds of systems around that industry is affecting the way games are created. So for instance, for the past 10 years, there's been the rise of a hobby scene with game jams. And that is already changing the way that games are created. And I can also talk more about that later. So my topic is about games as created, and most of the game studies has been about games as played. And most of us have some kind of understanding of games as played, but not necessarily about games as created. So it is very important area of study if we think about, for instance, that how much we use digital play in our modern life. So that's my talk. And behind this, there is a picture of some weird Turku game developers, actually. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Anna-Kaisa, and I think this doesn't work, but it's great because we have plenty of time for questions, and I have many, but I would like first to hear from the audience. And they are initially shy, I know. I've learned to know my people. So questions.
I'm super happy to answer any questions, so whatever comes to your mind. Are you
Yeah, I'm Tomi Pijiti Suovo from University of Turku, and I'm actually doing studies on games and digital games as well. One friend once asked me kind of a difficult question, that when you are studying games and game design, how much is it that you only record what has been done, and how much this study in academic field actually helps make creating better games? Do you have an answer for that with your experience?
I have one kind of an answer, yes. So if I understood correctly, that you were asking whether science could help us to make better games. Yeah. So yes, it can help us to make better games, but I think that we are very in the beginning of tons of game studies are actually rather normative towards design processes. And this is perhaps due to the nature that we tend to think that we need to be normative when we are looking from the pedestal to the common people and saying that maybe you should do things better. But in the case of digital game creation, it can be very difficult to actually earn that position because you don't know what you're even talking about. So we should have much more descriptive studies to understand the work of creating digital games so that we could be better in informing those processes. But then again, also game development utilizes a lot of tools that are done because of scientific discoveries and scientific developments. So we utilize a lot of computer science findings. And then we also, game studios, they use psychology, they use even ethnographers to understand their players better. So there are tons of different kind of areas that, for instance, nowadays, in a modern mobile game development, statisticians and analysts are the very much ones that big companies want to use, so that when they get data from people playing games, like millions and millions of people playing their games, Like, what does it actually mean when they quit in this certain spot? So those kind of like, that's just basic science, but it's not necessarily something that a developer that has done programming or art for the whole career would understand. So currently we are in a moment where also game companies, they try to utilize different areas of understanding. But that's only for the bigger companies. The smaller companies, if they have just 3 to 10 people, they might not be able to hire an ethnographer. But yes, we can improve, might take time in certain questions, and it is already used in certain other questions.
Okay, so more questions? Yes.
It is my understanding that Finland is quite successful in the development of mobile video games.
Yes.
Is it true?
Yes.
All right. So because you've been traveling so much to different conferences that you've been meeting with developers, do you maybe have some ideas why Finns are so good doing that?
We have a shared narrative for the success, but then obviously it is like I don't think that we have a wide enough of understanding of the old ecosystems that work. So there are a couple of factors that are kind of attributed to the success. First of all, there's been a good engineering education in Finland, and for the past decade or so, the competitive edge has been able to transform platform to another in digital game creation. So the better you are in programming, the better, and in other areas of engineering as well, the better you are having, the kind of faster you have been to adopt the changes. And then there's been the mobile game thing is partially could be explained to the fact that we were really early starting to learn mobile game development because of Nokia was kind of very close to us in game development. And a lot of the Finnish companies did work for Nokia or well, on that area. So it was very early that the mobile industry started. But then that doesn't explain everything. So also due to the fact that Finland has been a country with small companies, and when it's a country with small companies, it makes all the sense to be very sharing. So the cultures like the company cultures are kind of the community cultures has been so that people either share in seminars, like you could be our game developers and I would be a CEO of one company. I share what I've done for the past 6 months, and you could learn from that. Or that if you and I would be CEOs of one company, we might go for a lunch or something and share the knowledge, which is not always the same in other countries. So it might be more competitive, that you don't want to share the knowledge. Especially if you have a more stability with a bigger company, you might not have this kind of an interest. But if you have a very small company and the other one is also a small company, you don't know when you're going to merge or when both of you are bankrupt. So the future is very kind of volatile for the industry. So people have learned to share. So it's more of a community-driven thing. And then also for the thing is that we've had a strong hobby culture before jams as well. So demo scene, or kind of these computer demos that people created, a visual presentation or kind of testing the best power of the computer, like what you can do with that, what kind of spectacular things. They look like music videos or techno music videos, but they're made completely just by programming and run live. So that's been also, it's not just the education with the engineering side, but it's also been very passionate hobbyists and artists in the country. And that goes with the rest of the Nordics, which comes to the next point of the success factor is that we've also had the national funding system that has supported some of the kind of difficult points for the companies to develop their own technology, for instance. Maybe I forgot some, but there's tons of different narratives. Also, there's this kind of suspicion that there's something in the tap water, but I don't think that, maybe. Yeah.
Seriously? But this is no. It's a joke.
It's a highlight of it's actually a real title for some news of the game press. That is there something in the tap water in Finland? Okay, I'll explain you later.
Okay, but I actually have a related questions. Are there clear differences between games created in different countries? You know, games from Finland, for example, I mean, are different from, I mean, can you identify some
This is a
traits?
very good question. So the digital game industry has been born at the same time with the kind of development of globalization, and then obviously digital distribution has made it possible to completely skip the local market and then just go for international markets, which also goes builds to the fact that, for instance, some of our super successful games, the first one, like Remedy's Max Payne, is a story of a police officer in New York. So it doesn't really sound that Finnish. Then also, for instance, Clash of Clans, it's not really Finnish, like it could be from anywhere. And this same story goes with most of the games, that we actually reproduce a lot of the kind of such imagery that would fit to the biggest market, which is North America. So we could create a game of Kalevala, and there are a couple of those. There are such games, but they don't necessarily resonate with the largest paying customers. We could also try to create games for more Asian audiences to the east from us, but they don't want to pay. So the piracy problem is there bigger. So that's why, for instance, from Finland, it's more of the Northern American markets. And nowadays, more for also China. And I don't know if that's going to affect a little bit of the taste, but yeah, you can't really always tell at all. Like sometimes people, like this year we opened a museum of Finnish games to Tampere. And when visitors come in, they might, like Finnish visitors even, that they might be surprised that, oh, this game is actually Finnish, I didn't know that. Because it's not visible in the art or the creation in itself, and it's not stated. So sometimes when you find a game that you like, and you Google of that, you find the company webpage, but they don't even state where they are based. So you might not even find this information where your game was created. And then again, there's another issue for that too, is like sometimes games can be, let's say that Teemu puts a game on market and says that Teemu made it, but actually Teemu paid for me to make that game, and the contract was that I am not able to say anybody that I created that game. So I might be in a different country, for instance. So that doesn't happen that sneakily, but that also happens. And it also happens in Finland that Rovio made a game, but it was made in Tampere, blah, 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 blah.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yes, can you use the microphone? Actually, I don't know if you need to use the microphone. I think that the microphone is just for the recording, I guess. So maybe you use it.
I'm not sure if the topic is clearly related, but I've noticed this kind of with time, right? This rise of independent game makers and independent game developers, and the use of independently developed games compared to the the AAA games or the big companies. Do you think that this is because the tools to develop games have just become more available, or did the big company lose the sight on specific needs of the gamers that the independent developers actually managed to aim to, or both of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So question about like how can we understand the phenomenon of indie games? What happened? So first of all, yes, development tools for the past 10 years have become much more accessible. So 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was very expensive to buy the development, the consoles, for instance. And much more skill was also needed in order to create just a single game. So some of the tools have become completely free, and some of the tools have become so drag and drop-ish. I mean, like so easy to access that any one of you here can make a game in 2 days. And we know that it's a huge problem nowadays also in the markets, like different kinds of marketplaces like App Store, that there's like hundreds of games submitted per day. So there's tons tons of people trying to create games, so there's much more creators as well through to that fact. But then at the same time, if we think about this like a more successful indie games that might have a specific style or story, which is not necessarily something that a bigger company would do. So bigger companies might actually try to target for audiences that are with much more larger like shared interest of, like for instance, a big shooter that would be played by every single teenager in America, for instance. Like in comparison to topics that doesn't interest everybody. But then there is a market for smaller creators to do this kind of a diverse art, diverse artifacts that would still find the niche market for them. But the bigger companies might not be interested because of the potential cash flow and sometimes the higher risk in trying to do the niche. But then again, it's a risk business. So it has a high risk for almost all the companies, also the bigger ones. So it's not given that any of the companies that you know that create games would be still standing after 5 years. But I don't think that they've lost their understanding of the users. They are not targeting the smaller markets. They are trying to survive with the bigger markets. So it's well, I can't speak for all of them. So maybe some of them have completely lost what they are about to do, or kind of don't know what to do. But I think that the explanation for that is that the tastes of the mass market is a certain way, like in music or movies or something like that. We don't necessarily, all of us, we don't like same things. And then if our interests are combined, maybe it's not that super interesting for the human race.
Okay, more questions?
I can also...
I actually have a question that is related to game jams.
Yes.
How have they changed the game market somehow? What has been their influence, and why they've been, they became so popular?
Well, not sure how they have changed the game market. At the same time with game jams, because game jam is also a great place for you to create a game if you never actually... like maybe you created a game for 4 years, you never just finished it. So it's pushing you to finish some projects or start a new project that will eventually be finished in a short time. So it has contributed in itself to the number of games that there are, but at the same time the tools such as Unity and others, it's not entirely due to game jams that we have so many games. It's much more attributed to just people being interested in game culture and then creating their own games. But what it has the best in, like the biggest impact for the hobby culture, which game jams is, that it actually molds the way that games are created. So it is important for the design process, for instance, to be iterative and more prototype oriented than just ideas. So the past 15 years, for instance, we've had a development from a little bit more kind of a front emphasis for the creative process, moved into prototype-driven, from document-driven to prototype-driven development culture. So it is the fine-tunes within the way that people create games that game jams has the biggest impact. But also, I must say that some of the game jams are really great vessels of also pushing into different directions, topic-wise, for instance. So there are game jams that are, for instance, dedicated to topics of games for good, like serious gaming, or for instance, there can be very specific jam. For instance, there was a jam called Boob Jam, which was dedicated for the breast cancer cause, and people were just creating games about boobs in different way. So it can be a vessel for you to promote a certain topic in games as well. There is going to be Mum Jam in London, run by Rovio, this fall, which is for returning mothers to come back to the industry, so that they actually take care of the kids at the studio, and you can create a game and concentrate on that. So there's different levels, so it can be topical, it can be, can be different kinds of things. It can be different parts of the world that creates games. For instance, South Sudan was part of the Global Game Jam this year, so in the middle of the war they were still creating games from their own perspective. And you can see perhaps also more cultural heritage used in some of the games. Some game jams are dedicated for that. I could go over an hour of explaining how many different kinds of jams there are. So they also impact to the diversity of the games.
Thank you. More questions? A lot of people are worried about actually the fact that, well, you know, kids are spending a lot of time playing games. I mean, is there any concern? I mean, are you studying things like, you know, how these impact people?
Yeah,
I'm sure you are, actually.
There are tons of studies, and it also goes to the tradition of media studies and media impact studies. So the same kind of issues have been tackled with TV already and movies. As already said in the presentation, is that if we just talk about games, it's very difficult, but we could talk about particular games. And even like, for instance, if we talk about a very famous series of games, Doom, even those games, several of them, they're so different from each other that they don't necessarily have the same kind of causality with your psychology. So I think that there obviously games have impact to people, like text has an impact to people. We might not want, for instance, the very young kids to read Henry Miller, or I don't know what kind of books you want to kind of keep away from kids. So yeah, it's a very, very kind of difficult question, but it also, some of it contributes to the media panic. When there's a new thing, we get panicked. The common understanding, because it's not my area of expertise, but the common understanding is that we do know that there are causalities between problems, like social problems and problematic playing. So sometimes they go together, but the causality between is not necessarily so that the games created the problems, but these people already had problems before. And then, like in gambling, for instance, you escape your problems into a certain kind of activity. But it could be also that you escape to drinking, or you escape to extensive sports, or different kinds of other things. So it's not necessarily only games that have these problems, but it's in the media all the time. Because it's one of the newest things, and it's really kind of also very important for the modern kids.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there was a question here.
This thing of the use of games in children of different, like, wrong ages. Of course, I mean, anyone would claim that, you know, games and everything, like gambling or alcohol or anything, they're not bad themselves. But of course, if you give the wrong tool to the wrong child or the wrong age, that clearly would affect something. For example, you wouldn't give Doom to a 5 or 4 years old, or GTA or something like that. But that, of course, you know, they have the PEGI system at the moment.
Yes.
But this is the thing. Why, from the sociological point of view, people are aware of suggestion in movies or in TV programs. So if a movie's non-suggested for kids, parents do not bring the kids. Whereas nobody seems to care about the PEGI system. Like, it's just there. It's a huge number on the game, but nobody cares about it. I've received myself. I've played GTA when I was underage. I say it. And nobody, you know, why is this kind of nobody care? Even though everybody cares about the effect of video games on children, but at the same time, nobody uses the only good system, you know, that it's being given.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very interesting one too. I think that the kind of landscape of attitudes have changed for the past decade or two. So we know more about digital games, and they're more part of our everyday lives. Some people are even more terrified now than before, but we also learn that they are they're not that different to things that we've seen before, like sports. So I don't know how many adults are actually very concerned that whether your kids are playing too much hockey. It's like they're becoming so good at it, and they're so you usually just put more money to that hobby and hope to God that they become millionaires, and I don't think that's even good. Or for instance, the very abusive culture of ballet, so like extensive hobby of certain things, like these kind of things. But we are more familiar, and also we are more familiar of their better sides, like the cultural value of ballet, or the effect of hockey as something that people would move more and have a little bit more exercise. So I think that a lot of the attitudes that we have for digital games specifically is to do also about ignorance and the kind of a not valuing them as cultural pieces as well. So there's so many absolutely brilliant pieces of digital games that can actually mediate experiences that we would never get through books or movies or anything else. So we do understand their value, but it's not necessarily widely spread. So they are undervalued, and that also can create this kind of not caring about the system that has been created within the games. It's like because they're just bad in general. So you don't necessarily be the parent, for instance, who would know about the PEGI system, which is, by the way, it is the system that is trying to give you the suggestion which age is appropriate for people to play a certain digital game. So not every game is obviously, like not every other piece of art is not also rated, but we do have the system similar to movies that would help parents also to kind of choose and try to work with that culture, because there's a gap between the younger and the older generation. So we've had, even like in the University of Tampere, we've had study of that was comparing the book reading and then the computer game playing, and the kids just want to have their parents part of the culture, but the parents are not interested at all, or like at least not nowadays. More parents obviously are interested of what people are, what kids are playing, because it's sometimes also very difficult to get into. But I don't know if there's any excuse nowadays not to get into, because for instance you could go to YouTube, like 30% of the contents of YouTube is about playing games. So if you don't know about the game, you don't necessarily need to, nowadays, like it's quite recent, so you don't necessarily need to play it. Like if you don't have time to play it, you don't know how to play it, then it's not your thing. But you could go and try to get into the culture more through the Let's Play videos, for instance. But then again, it's not exactly the same. So I've seen, sometimes when you look at someone playing a game, it feels much more, it feels very different than when playing the game itself. So there's but still it's about not understanding what happens, and also maybe not always being interested in the younger generation hobbies, basically.
Yeah, one more question. Meanwhile, I have two completely silly questions, but I will ask them out.
During your 10 years of research here, have you seen much injection into other fields from game design methods and game mechanisms? Are people who design lumber tractors and things like that, design cars, coming to see how people are designing games?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I can really answer that, but the question is, have I seen? So I haven't seen too much of kind of bleeding information or even actually retrieving information from game industry to other industries. But there are overlaps as well. So if you would think about lumber, like forestry, so like how to teach the people to use the heavy machinery. Well, I don't know if they're called heavy machinery, but the machines that they use in a modern lumber business. So you could learn that through simulation, for instance. So it is something that even creating a engaging or immersive, pleasurable simulation that might actually need skills from the at least from the same pool, but also from design, game design perspective of understanding how it feels to use that system in order to learn better. I do believe that there would be much more to also give out from the game industry, but for the past decades it's been a growth of more kind of an internal growth, and also reflection of what game industry is, and a building of the identity of what digital game making or game making in general means. So I think that it's about time to start doing that. And for the past year or two, I've heard more developers talking about that the game industry conferences should have more of other fields, so they become more interested in that. And if we think about the 2020 politics, like if we are educating more and more game developers, where do we actually put them? We only have like 3,000 people working on the Finnish companies, but where should we put them? Well, I think obviously with everything I've done, I would like to put them everywhere. So for instance, we could think about different kinds of business that has to do with service, that has a lot to kind of learn from game design, which is basically design of a human interaction between a system and a human. So that's a very interesting and important field to also deliver to other fields, like service design, which is like games are nowadays more of a service. We've learned that. It hasn't been the choice to learn, but it's been kind of an important thing for the game developers to build their products so that people are, that you change things if something is not working in the game and so forth. So there's a lot more to learn also on the other fields. And I wouldn't think that in the future it wouldn't be so uncommon that we actually have someone that is educational background is in game design, but they work on a completely surprising field.
Okay, no, it's a silly question.
Okay.
Okay, but this comes from I'm not a gamer. I occasionally play games, but I'm not a gamer. So it's why most of the games are about shooting. It seems to me that everything is like shooting. What is this shooting thing? Also, I mean, this is, as I said, not very deep. But also, shooting is not a very. It looks more like a male thing, rather than a female thing. And I was just wondering whether there are main common themes in games which are just repeated, and in the end all games are variants of like shooting thing, or and how this compares with this female versus male issue.
Yeah, it's not a silly question at all. First of all, there's a lot of shooting games because shooting is quite easy to do. Like even a simple game.
Not for me, Anna-Kaisa. I have huge difficulties in shooting.
I mean, like a game where the main mechanics is to kill something or destroy something. It's very easy to create. It doesn't really,
to create really.
To make that kind of a game where someone shoots something. It's quite. We have a lot of examples that we can draw from, and it's not that difficult, or is it? It's quite easy. Yeah. Okay.
Shooting is easy.
Some themes or mechanics that we see in games might have to do with the fact that it's quite easy to create an interesting kind of experience loop based on that kind of activity, and then sometimes also the shooting things have some connection to that the industry has been connected to simulation education for instance, Northern American.
Isn't
army
it really
education.
like 80% of the games are shooting? Or am I exaggerating?
I don't think you're exaggerating. It's not 80%, but there are tons of shooting games, and so some of the more kind of elaborate game experiences need much more work, and we're just kind of starting to create different kinds of new mechanics. For instance, there's this one jam game that was based on actual physics of a snake. So you are trying to move in the world as an actual, like a biologically correct snake. So there's also all sorts of different kinds of games that you probably haven't heard about that would be perhaps more interesting to you. But for the past, also it's been very male-dominated industry, is still very, very male-dominated industry, and sometimes people, when they create games, they draw from the shared kind of interests, which would be when you come to the game industry and you already love the games that have been created, and you start to kind of, because you like that, why wouldn't you fix something that is not broken? But also to create games, as I said, is an iterative process, and the more foreign the understanding, like more foreign idea you have, the more loops you need, and it's more expensive. So it is easier to take something that already works and try to create something new through that. So we could still have same mechanics of shooting, but it could be, for instance, hearts and hugs or something, or the representational level could be different. But there are tons of also companies that don't believe that they cater for a certain kind of adolescent male audience, and that is a big audience. So they don't believe in kind of trying to create the new market, because you would actually need to create it. So yeah, there is also bias in terms of the topics, because it is repeating. So sometimes we even have I could say that the problem is within the industry, that we attract people that already like the games that have been already created, and they create the same games that has been already created. So it is like built on that. But one part of it is because it can be easier to create something where you destroy instead of where you create. But if you think about very trendy games, less than 10 years ago, there's a lot of creativity games. So there is so many games, and I think current problem is discoverability. So you might not actually find the game that you would like. And if the commercial bodies are doing that, they don't necessarily want you to find your niche. They want to force you to be the customer of the dominant genre, for instance. But I think that in Turku, I don't know if there's anybody from Jukka's team, but they're trying to create this kind of a tool where it would be independent from the platform holders that would recommend you the games that you would like. So that since there are hundreds of new games every day, just for the App Store, I think there might be very, very, those games that like any of you could find your favorite game, but it's just not, you can't find it because you can't go through the thousands and millions of games that have been created so far. So that's one of the problems. But yes, not a silly question.
Okay, good. More? Yes. Can you use the mic?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, how much have you studied these, when you have gone to the field, how much have you interviewed game developers from small to medium sized game companies, and how much have you interviewed developers from these AAA, the largest companies making games in the world, for example, Activision, Blizzard, or these kinds of huge designed by committee type of companies? How do these differ, these small and large enterprises, in the game design process?
Yes, my data is slightly Nordic bias, and most of the Nordic companies are smaller. I have less interviews with the huge companies, but there's a lot of talk about also the differences between development cultures. It is much more flat organization for the Nordic companies. Perhaps there's more sharing, for instance. It's a little different to the bigger companies that have hierarchies. And even if you compare it, like you go to, for instance, Korea and companies like Nexon, it's very hierarchical. Japanese companies, I don't know if you can even address the people above you. So obviously there are differences, but also sometimes the game companies might be the ones that are closer to the modern kind of office culture to the West, for instance, in the East. Than any other companies in the same country. So they're also kind of young companies, and the culture can be a little bit towards the style that we have in the Nordics. But my data has to do a lot with the Nordic developers and also small to medium. And one of the very concrete difference between that to bigger companies is that people hold lots of different hats. So if your company is 3 to 10 people or 10 to 30, it's not necessarily that you're very specialized. But if you go to a company that will do a production of 200 people working on the same game, so your job might be just creating 3D mugs or Windows or something like that. So like you might be super specialized in the area of that production. So obviously there is a lot of difference in that. And sometimes I've heard developers talking when they've been even in Finland to be in a bigger company that they go for startup because they didn't want to do anymore. There was one sound designer that did sounds for guns, and I leave it to you which game it is, but he didn't want to continue with the company because he wanted to do other sounds as well. So he went to a startup to do other sounds. So there are a lot of there are a lot of differences with that kind of from small to big. But we don't really have a big production. I think the biggest productions would be Remedy's productions, like even Rovio. I think that the bigger companies with mobile area, they don't have, the teams are small still. But if there's like a big team, it also needs much more management. So when I was talking about the document-driven versus prototype-driven processes, the more documents you might need at a certain point when your company becomes bigger, because you need to have a shared point of understanding where the design direction is going. But at the same time also that for the past 10 years, it's like comparing big companies or small companies to each other can be also difficult because they have formed their own culture of working. And sometimes, like for instance, roles are very specific for the production or roles are specific for the company in itself. So when you see a business card and there is a title, you don't necessarily know what they actually do. So that might be like it's been forming for the past years. So from the first days that I started to these days, it's like it's a complete like night and day. There's like a lot of like more sophistication, for instance, in the roles and in the management system, and they've brought in more also from like, because a very common story has been that you start as a programmer, designer and an artist in a company. You have 3 people. It's like a holy trinity for a game company. And then you start hiring other people. So the programmer eventually becomes a CTO, so chief technical officer. And designer might actually become CEO, which knows nothing about money and stuff. And then the artist becomes a creative director. And so people have kind of just moved in the ladder, but they don't have the skills that would be in a management level. But nowadays they bring also management experts, I mean like people that actually have a degree or experience from other fields to make sure that the companies work more efficiently or the culture is better. And you know, all sorts of different roles have also emerged for the past decade. I don't know if that answered enough, but yeah.
Okay, I think maybe last question, and then Anna-Kaisa will stay with us, and so you can just come and stay here and hang out and ask her questions. So, yes.
Because nowadays, like you said, we have very, very lot of games. So how is it even possible that some games become like globally favorite games among a lot of people? Because all the games, it seems now like we have all possible games, all possible ideas, all possible bases, but how is it possible?
Oh, so how is it possible that even like within that high competition, like somebody becomes a global success story? Well, I think that well, like in any other areas as well, it's a form of expertise trying to kind of cover the global markets. Like how do you actually win that competition? But I can tell how it is, for instance, what kind of things are done in a game company in order to try to be as good as possible in the global market. So for instance, when you create a mobile game, nowadays what you do, like a lot of the games are, for instance, free-to-play games, and one of the reasons for that is that you need to lower the threshold for people to start playing so that you get the player in. But then obviously if your game is not interesting enough, you're losing your customers because they didn't even ever paid something. So you need to make sure that they enjoy the game while they play and they are not devoting their time to something else. So when you launch a game, when game becomes available for a global market, it has already gone through smaller testing markets, and they've done changes to the games in order to make them work better for certain kinds of audiences and make sure that people actually like it, because you can't necessarily know for sure what is going to work or not. So they do a lot of testing. They can also do testing with icons, because that's the first step to get the game. It's like, which kind of icon does it need to be with a spit, or is it like left or right, or it's like all sorts of tiny things that is normal. It's normal for any kind of commercial activity that you need to understand what works and what doesn't, and what are the caveats of your business. So you test the audiences, your product has been kind of created in already a very iterative manner, but then like you're almost done, you still make changes and you make sure that you understand the players so that they can spread with their strategy to different countries as well. So for instance, Finnish games are oftentimes tested other English-speaking areas, like I think New Zealand, for instance. Teemu, do you remember? Or someone else can remember?
Canada might be one.
Yeah. So before you go to the States, which is the biggest market area, you go to market areas that are similar to that, so that you don't fuck it up on that country. It's like you have that small window to convince people to start playing your game. So you need to test it with the smaller markets, and a lot of the games are killed with the testing markets. So, I mean, like you decide not to move forward because it's too expensive, or you make enough changes so that it starts to work there, and then you launch the game, you get the critical mass, and you get the attention, and you continue improving your game in that. Obviously, there are a lot of different kinds of ways with marketing nowadays. For instance, some of the free-to-play games, they use there is an advertisement of other games within it. So you get exposed to those games. Like the marketing budget might be like really, really huge nowadays. So it didn't used to be like that. People just, we just create a perfect game, and then if it's good, then it will sell some units, and if it's not. But nowadays you can't do that because it's a huge competition. You need to be able to make sure that you've done a strategy that you can cover the market areas where you can get the money. So the statistics of or metrics of your players is very important. You need to understand which parts of your game are actually creating revenue and which are not. So it is not magic, or it's not pure luck. You might need some luck, and some games, obviously, through the kind of fortunate events, becomes much more kind of successful in certain spots. For instance, Finnish game developer Colossal Order from Tampere, they created a city building game they were launching right after the very famous city building game SimCity. But the fans were super disappointed on the game. And fortunately, the Finnish game had those areas much better. So they actually could use this kind of a disappointment that was a lucky thing as well, because it could have been that the fans were like super into that game and would not care about this Finnish game that had no name before. So there are these lucky events, but obviously they've done their kind of homework with the users already. So they knew what the users wanted to have on the game. And when they launched the game, it was a success through that. But it is a business. So there's tons of different ways that the big companies try to make sure, and even smaller ones. Any Finnish game company with a free-to-play game or a smaller mobile game, if they're serious enough, they are really looking into the advertisement. One of the areas is, for instance, using influencers. So it's not that you're not calling game magazines anymore to get coverage. You're not flying people with like these corruption things. Like you're not flying people to eat fancy food that are writing for game magazines, but you actually might fly in the YouTubers that would cover and make videos of your product, playing the game, and through their fans to get the understanding of this product is existing and it's cool. And some developers even kind of go even further with that, it's not just the exposure of the product, but the product is designed so that, for instance, YouTubers or Twitch streamers can have special content that only people on their channel can actually see that or use that, or their players get it. So there is this kind of different kinds of business innovations has been, and it's still ongoing all the time. So it's a high competition field. You need to be smart in order to have your opportunity to kind of build a global market possibility. Depends on your product and your audience. Yes?
Okay, so before thanking Anna-Kaisa, I would like to remind you of our next Science Cafe event that will be on Saturday, November 18th, I think. Oh, yes, I think it's 18th. This will be a Science Cafe about scientific literacy. That is a topic very dear to me. And Professor Kari Enquist from the University of Helsinki will be our next Science Cafe speaker. Well, now I would like to thank again Anna-Kaisa for this very interesting discussion. And as I said before, please come and talk to her. We will be here for a while. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.